Hey everyone, it's Colin Smith here from PhotoshopCafe.com, and today we're going to look at creating HDRs, panoramas, and even HDR panoramas inside of Lightroom. Now I'm going to be using Lightroom Classic, but this will also work very similar using the other versions of Lightroom. Let's get started. So why don't we start with HDR? So HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. Dynamic range is how much detail can a camera show between shadows and highlights at the same time. If you look at a human eye, let's do an example. Look around your room right now. Look for the brightest area that you can see. Now, really look in there. Maybe there's some reflections, and please don't look directly at the sun or directly into a light bulb, but look at the reflections. If you look carefully, you can see color, you can see detail in there. Look at the darkest point that you can see in your room now, assuming you're not, sitting in a dark room with a light bulb just burning in the corner, but a regularly lit room. And notice you can make out some detail there. Now, if you were to photograph that shadow and show that detail, half the rest of the room would be just blown out into white. The same thing goes if you were to set your exposure for that brightest part, everything else would be too dark to see the detail. So that's dynamic range. The human eye can see more dynamic range, and part of that is because your pupil opens and closes and it constantly adjusts. Let's pay our attention to the screen right now, and let's look at a photograph. So here's a photograph at Balboa Pier, and it's pretty much nighttime. So if we look at this, we'll look at the brightest areas. We've got these lights here on the building and the clock tower. You can see the lights on the pier and the setting sun in the distance, and everything else is completely black. So the camera has enough dynamic range to capture this detail here, but not much else. Let's look at the next shot. So here's a very bright shot. In fact, it's too bright and there's blurriness going on, but don't worry about that for now. We'll talk about that in a second. But what we're doing now is we're bringing out the details. Incredible amount of detail that we can bring out here in these shadow areas. Look at all this detail. We can make out the wood. We can see the color, the sand, the texture, everything. But if you notice, everything else is just white and blown out. So the camera can capture this amount of detail, but not the bright area as well as all that shadow. Now we might get something more in the middle. And if you look at this in the middle here, you can see this is not bad. We're still losing some detail here in the brightest areas on the building. Notice that. And in some of the shadows here, it's getting very noisy and grainy, and we're starting to lose some of the definition there. So the camera has the ability to capture a particular dynamic range. That's the amount, how dark and how light can it go at the same time. So we can do, as we do with the eye, the pupil adjusts. So we can adjust for the brighter parts. We can adjust for the darker parts. But to show it all at once is very difficult. In the future, the dynamic range on cameras is going to continue to get better. And in fact, it is getting a lot better now. These are raw files. So what you want to be doing is actually capturing more than one shot. So if we look at this, let me just hit the G key, go back to the grid. If we look at this, there's one shot we've got here. There's the second shot. And this shot is picking up more of the detail here, but of course everything is getting black. There's a third shot showing nice detail in the shadows, but we're losing the highlights. Once again, this one here, which I showed you before, captures all the really bright detail. And then this one captures, all the dark areas, brightens those up. But it's getting a little soft and blurry. So what you want to do is you want to expose for these different shots and then merge them together. That's what we're going to be looking at. So an example of a high dynamic range scene is something like nighttime or sunset or sunrise, some of the best times for shooting. When you've got the sun visible, that sun is going to be very bright, and it's going to be difficult to show any color or any detail in that sun or around that sun while showing detail in the foreground, particularly if that foreground is still in shadow. So this is why we do HDR. This is why we bracket. So here's some tips. When you're shooting, what you want to do is get your camera nice and stable. Now, I recommend using a tripod. If you don't have a tripod, you can do handheld, like I did on this example. And Lightroom will do a pretty good job of aligning it. Now, when you do that, make sure that you're able to hold your camera steady for the longest exposure. In this case, this is half a second, and I wasn't able to hold it steady, so this would have worked better on a tripod. However, I'm looking at this shot here, and this is 1/8 of a second, and you know what? That's going to work. We're going to be fine. So that's the first step, is stability. The second thing is you want to change these settings on the camera. Just put everything into manual, lock everything down, and change either the ISO between shots when you bracket it, or change your shutter speed. Don't change the aperture, because when you change your aperture, you're going to change the depth of field, and that's going to cause blurring. So keep that fixed, and just determine where you want that. If it's a darker scene, you're probably going to want to open that aperture up a little bit so you can get more light in, and avoid using that long shutter speed. If it's a very, very bright situation, then you're probably going to want to close it down a little bit and use a faster shutter speed. So once you've determined the shots, you want to put your camera into auto exposure bracketing, and then set it. In most cases, I do -2 f-stops and +2 f-stops, and that'll capture 3 photographs quite nicely. And that would give me something like these 3 in the middle here, and wouldn't get the extremes. In this case, I went to 5 shots. So I've got more of the extreme in the shadows there, which might not be necessary. Getting extreme highlights here and getting the extreme shadows. So in this case, I don't really want to use all 5 of these, because this one is soft and blurry. So I could use 3 or 4. So what we're doing now is we're going to put those shots together. Once you've captured them, you want to put them together. And the way to do that is to select the first one, hold down the Shift key and click, and that will select 3. I'm going to hold down the Control or Command key and click again. I want to add this 4th shot. Now, if you have a shot like this, which is just blurry, you probably want to leave it out unless there's essential detail here that you're not capturing in other shots. I can see this shot here is getting the detail that I wanted in the shadow, so I don't necessarily need that shot. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to right click, and then we're going to choose Photo Merge. Now, when we're in Photo Merge, choose HDR. And now it's going to start to put these together. And look at this. This is a much better looking photograph. It's not perfect. You've got some weird stuff going here. We'll talk about that. Okay, so we've got 2 options that we've got turned on. The first one is Auto Align. So if you're doing this handheld, the Auto Align is going to align those and make sure that they're not, out of sync with each other. So it's going to align those photographs nicely. So if they're slightly out of alignment, it'll just pull them in. Auto settings just kind of gives us a starting place. If we turn off the auto settings, you can see this is what it's going to look like here. In fact, you can turn it on or off. It doesn't matter, because these are just adjusting the initial sliders in the develop panel that we can change later on. So, leave it on or off. It's up to you. Now, this next one needs to be changed now. The Auto Align obviously needs to be set at this point, and so does Deghost. Auto setting doesn't matter. All right, so if we look at deghosting, what it does is, if we look at this photo, see how we get this doubling? Well, we get a doubling here. And what that is movement. So when I've captured these different shots, the 4 shots we're using right now, those people are not in the same location, and all 4 of those. This would also work for fast moving clouds, waves, leaves, different things like that, although it's not so noticeable on those areas. But if you get a person or a vehicle or a bird flying through, you get what's known as ghosting. See the little ghost behind them? So deghosting will enable us to get rid of that. So what you want to do is use the lowest amount of deghosting as possible. We want to get rid of this ghosting. So why don't we choose low? And it's just going to take a second for it to recalculate, rebuild the preview. And if we look at that, look, it got it nicely. Notice the ghosting on the people are gone, and it's gone there. Now, the reason we could probably use this at low is because these were not really fast moving objects. If you had a faster moving object, or an object that's taking up more of the screen space, you might have to increase that to medium or high. Now, if you turn on show ghost overlay, this area of red will show you where the ghosting was. See that? There's where the ghosting is, and now it's being reduced or eliminated. So that's great. So now you want to choose merge. So when you're merging, what's happening now is Lightroom is creating a new file. You can see on the top left here, it shows the progress, and there's the result. And notice it's a DNG file. So what Lightroom's done is taken the image data from those 4 images. Now it could be as little as 2, it could be as many as 100, but you want to do a minimum of 2, obviously. Usually 3 works pretty well for most scenarios. And then what it's going to do is it's going to merge the information together, create a new DNG file that has all the information on that file, so that's going to enable us to adjust it and get a better result. Great. Now, I just want to mention something quickly. Notice how we had these progress bars going across the top. You can actually start more than one process. So, if I wanted to merge those, I could select those, right-click, choose merge, select these, right-click, and just start stacking them up, and you will see they'll stack there. So you can batch process them. I mean, you still have to manually do it, but you can have more than one merging at the same time. All right, let's have a look here at this photograph, and I'm just going to double click and look at that. That's not looking too bad. So now what we're doing is we're showing this beautiful sunset scene, or almost nighttime scene here, and it's also showing a lot of detail here in the foreground. So we've got a lot of detail. Let's go to the develop module, and the next thing we want to do is just set our settings. So the first thing you might want to set is your profile. So let's just choose on our profile browser here, and this is going to take us into our browsers. Now we have Adobe RAW, and I won't spend too much time on this, or we can go down to the camera settings. So let's go through some of these. That clear is not bad. That deep is actually showing the dynamic range quite well. Landscape, portrait, neutral. So you can see a lot. This was shot on a Sony a7 III. So these are the Sony profiles. All right, let's have a look at the Adobe profiles. There's Adobe Color, which, as you can see, was the first one. Adobe Lightroom uses Adobe Color as the default profile, in case you were wondering. And we can go through some other ones. We can see a landscape. Standard is actually not bad either. Portrait, neutral, or vivid. Now, if you want to go for a more natural result, you might want to start with the Adobe Neutral, which I'm going to turn on, because what this does is almost like a log in some ways, meaning it's not pushing it too far in the shadows or highlights. So there's not a lot of contrast. So we can add the contrast with our adjustments, which is, I think we're going to do that. So let's hit close. And now there's the adjustments. Remember when we turned on auto, this is the settings that it got. Now, if I want to hold down the Alt or the Option key, I can reset both of those, and that's what it would look like with only the profile selected. So the first thing you probably want to do is push the highlights and decide how much highlight detail do I want in here. So this is how I normally do it, is I'll normally pull the highlights in, and then I'm going to adjust exposure a little bit. So let's brighten up the exposure and then pull the highlights back in to kind of match. So this is that highlight area. Notice we've got lots of detail here in our building. We've got our sunset looking nice. Don't worry about saturation yet. We can bring all that back later. Maybe we want to open up the shadows a little bit more. Now you don't want to push the shadows all the way up, unless you're looking for that illustrative sketched look, which you can. Now, let me just quickly mention that, because I know some people like what's known as the HDR effect. If you want the HDR effect, just increase the highlight shadow all the way up and then crank up clarity. That will give you that effect. Today we're going to go for a more natural, realistic result. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the shadow and we're going to pull it back a little bit, just to something that's a little bit more believable. So we want to start opening up these shadows and showing some detail. But this is a nighttime scene. We're not trying to make it look like daytime. So we could do that and maybe even pull the exposure back. So I'm kind of liking this. So it's not plugging up all the shadows here. It's starting to show a hint of detail, but you know, the main parts here, we're not blowing out our details and our lights, and clearly we're seeing the part in the sky. So I like what we're getting here for exposure. This is good. Now, we've got a very low contrast because of the Adobe Neutral. We can push the contrast up if we want, but what I'm going to do is, rather than push contrast, is we're going to adjust the whites and blacks independently. Because we've got all this beautiful dynamic range to work with, let's really work it. Contrast is the same as pushing whites and blacks at the same time. That would be like increasing whites and darks. That's what increasing contrast does. But whites and blacks give us separate control over the bright and dark areas. So let's push the blacks just a little bit. Just, if you look at the histogram up there, notice it's just hitting the edge. I might want to just kind of just let some areas fall into pure black. So we don't want to lift the shadows too much. All right, let's take these whites and push them a little bit more. Notice we start to get more contrast in the brighter areas of the photo. And I'm kind of liking the overall look and feel. So if we hit the backslash key, we can see there's before with no adjustments and there's after with our adjustments. And we're definitely getting to somewhere that I like. Now remember, this is my personal taste. Feel free to move these adjustment sliders around to what suits your taste. Same with the temperature. Maybe you want to warm it up a little bit, or maybe you would prefer to cool it. Now this is completely subjective. Some people love this cool look because it kind of accentuates that cool evening. And some people like the warmer look because it kind of looks a little bit like, you know, these lights are just kind of falling and maybe a little bit of the color from the sky. I've found from polling people that people generally prefer it a little bit warmer, but once again, it's completely subjective. All right, so let's move down to a couple more settings. We might give this just a little touch of clarity. And what that does is it just brings back a little bit of the detail here that could be lost in some of these areas. Now, I'm not a fan of going hard on clarity because I don't like the result. So I like to just go a little bit. And since they added texture, I'll use texture to bring out that surface detail here on the sand and not so much the clarity. I'll bring out the clarity, works really well for edges. Kind of almost like an unsharp mask in a kind of way, even though it's not technically sharpening. It's increasing the contrast in the midtones, but it does add a little bit of that. All right, we're looking pretty good. Now, some people get pretty heavy with the vibrance. Now, I'm not going to turn the vibrance all the way up there like you see sometimes on a faux HDR, but I'm going to give it just a little boost. And the reason for that is, remember, when I chose that profile, I went for a neutral profile. And this gives me the ability to push this back later. So if we look at this before and after, now of course that's just showing the present slider, but look at what we were able to do inside of this shot. This is our HDR versus our regular exposure. That's what the camera, losing all the detail here, everything's plugged up there, but then doing the HDR, we'll be able to bring out this beautiful detail. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pivot and we're going to look at some panorama, and then we're going to come back and we're going to do an HDR panorama where we're going to combine the technologies. So let me just go up to the top here to show all my photographs, and we're just going to scroll down to a nice panorama that I've captured. So let's find a nice scene here. And if we're looking at some of these nice scenes in Hawaii is a good example. Actually, let's just pause and we're going to come back for the panel. Pause. Okay, here's some photographs that I captured for Panorama. I shot these on my drone, and if any of you guys have been following my work, I do a lot of aerial photography, and mostly I do HDRs and panoramas with the drone. So here's Waikiki Beach. And obviously, I'm not going to be able to capture all of this in one shot because it's a very wide scene. It's a vast scene, and that's why we use a panorama. Now, a panorama is just a great way to show this expression. Now, when we're shooting a very wide scene such as this for a panorama, there's a couple of rules you want to kind of pay attention to. And the first and most important rule is overlap. Generally speaking, you want to have a minimum of a 30% overlap so you can get a good stitch when those images are put together. So just kind of bear that in mind. And now when I'm doing aerial stuff, for those of you who are shooting with a drone, little tip, I usually increase that by about 50%. And the reason for that is with the very wide lens, you get more distortion. For example, I'm sitting in a stationary position. Look at these two towers here. And as I yaw to the right, notice how much distortion I get. So if you have a wide lens, or using a drone, or like a GoPro, something like that, just give it a little bit more overlap, and it's just going to kind of help it deal with that. Another thing to bear in mind is when you rotate it, try to rotate it on the nodal point, meaning just around about near where the back of the lens is. Try to rotate your camera from that point rather than swinging your body all the way around, and that will reduce parallax. All right, so once you've captured your shots, you're going to select the first one, hold down the shift key, and that's going to select all the photos we're going to be using. Now we're going to right click and go back to this photo merge menu, and yeah, spoiler alert, HDR Panorama is coming next. So let's choose Panorama. And this is quite interesting. So one of the things I love about this is Lightroom's ability to very quickly build a preview. Now this preview is not the panorama. Lightroom has not started building the panorama yet. All it's done is build as a preview. And notice I can scale that. I can change the size of it. Now, spherical is pretty much the projection you're going to be using most of the time. You can experiment with these other ones when you're using different types of cameras, but cylindrical will make things look a little bit taller, but generally spherical works really, really well. Now, notice you get this hemispherical kind of an effect around there, kind of like when you take a globe and then you take the if you were to peel off the sticker that goes around a globe, it would kind of look like this. And that's because of the curvature of the lens, and it's kind of creating a semi-sphere. So what we want to do is fix those edges. Now, there's several ways we can do this. In fact, there's 3 ways we can do it here inside of Lightroom. The first one is to crop it. So if we choose auto crop, it's going to crop out those parts. And you know what? A lot of the time, that's going to work just perfectly. Let me turn that off though. There's a second option. That second option is to use boundary warp. So what boundary warp will do is it will stretch those pixels, kind of like when you print on super putty and then you stretch it. Watch what happens. As I begin to move this, it stretches it until there's no pixels lost. Everything is in here, and it stretched it to fit. Now, in some situations, you look at this and you can say, hey, you know what? This looks good. I like it. There's not too much distortion compared to this. And other times, there might be too much distortion and it's not usable. Now, there's a third option within this, without doing the real third, maybe this is a 2.5, 2B, is we can combine different ones. So if we wanted to move the boundary warp a little bit, and it's filling up these edges a little bit and it's looking nice and it's not distorting too much just yet, you can combine it with crop. So if we turn the auto crop, it will crop what's left. So watch what happens if I use this in conjunction with boundary warp. See that? So you can use those two together. Now let me turn off the auto crop, and we're going to turn the boundary warp down. There's a third option, and this is the one that was more recently added, and that's to fill edges. So if you have a photograph like this where we're looking at things like sky and the sea, and there's not really a lot of detail around the edges that's essential, we could try the fill edges. And this uses this content aware fill technology, and this doesn't stretch any pixels. It leaves everything as it is, and notice it's working really well on this picture. Now, sometimes you can find some doubling on those edges, And, you know, you can kind of fix those with the clone stamp, you know, or the repair tool in Lightroom. You can do that. In this case, I'm looking at it. I'm looking around those edges, and you know what? That looks great. So I'm happy with that option. All right. Once you're happy with that preview, then we're going to choose merge. So right now, it's just in memory. It hasn't put anything into Photoshop, into Lightroom just yet. Now, there's another option. You can create a stack, so that will put the merged files with it into a stack, and it'll just kind of keep everything together if you wanted to do that. In this case, I'm just going to keep them inside of the catalog the way they are. And I'm just going to click merge. Now, just as happened with the panorama, with the HDR, the panorama is building a new file. You can see it's happening. And what it's doing right now is it's actually stitching those together. It's taking the full raw files, putting them together into a new DNG file. So when that DNG file is created, it's going to be added into the film strip at the bottom. And also, it's going to be a new DNG file is actually going to be put on your drive. No matter where these photos are, this is going to be put inside the same folder with them. And if we double click now, we can see we've got this beautiful panorama image. We can go into develop, and we can pull the highlights down a little bit. Now, I had the auto, you know, the auto settings turned on here, just like we did with the HDR. I didn't want to repeat that. I'm just going to warm that up a little bit. And, you know, you can play around with the shadows. If you want to go a little higher here, just so we can pull our exposure back a little bit, you can do that as well. And as you can see here, you can make these adjustments. Zoom in, we've got a ton of detail here. So this is creating a very large file. So there's our panorama all set. Okay, guys, are you ready for it? This is where we're going to put everything that we've learned together now, and we're going to create the ultimate in photographs, and that's an HDR panorama. And this is where we can combine both HDRs and a panorama. So if we look at this shot that I got at Waikiki Beach, you can see that I've bracketed each shot. So essentially we're shooting a panorama, but instead of shooting one photograph for each position, what we're doing is we're shooting bracketed shots. So here we have 3 shots. We've got the regular exposure, we've got it underexposed and overexposed to the left. Then we rotate the camera, shoot another bracket, rotate the camera, shoot another bracket. You get the idea. And this is great because we have a very high dynamic range in this scene that you might not realize when you look to the left, but when you look to the right, we've got this sunrise. And it would be very difficult to get all of this in one shot. If we look at it here, we can see detail, but look at that, we've lost all the detail in the sky. Here we can see detail in the clouds, and everything is very, very dark. Medium exposure doesn't quite get it. So what we've done is we've combined them all. Now, one of the amazing things about Lightroom is it has the ability to merge both an HDR and a panorama together. Now, in most cases, this works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a situation where we have this photograph where everything is going to work fine. Then for the more advanced users, I'm going to show you what to do when it doesn't work. So what we're going to do is select all of these images, just hit Control A, and that would be Command A on the Mac, and we've selected all 15 photos. Now we right click, go to Photo Merge, and we can see there's HDR Panorama, HDR Panorama. So when we click on here, it's just going to give us the preview. And right now what it's doing is it's just kind of building us that preview in the background. And let's see if it's going to work. Look at that. We're going to get an amazing photograph out of this. So now we're just looking at this inside the regular scene that we're used to looking at. Just looks like a regular panorama. And we can choose, you know, boundary warp or all the other options that we've already looked at. In this case, I'm going to choose auto crop. And I think that's working kind of good, but there's a little bit there I'd like to see. So I'm just going to push the boundary warp up just a little bit. And see, that just gives us a little clearance there with the water. And I think this is going to work quite nicely. All right, what we're going to do is turn off auto settings. And I'm going to do those settings myself because it looks a little cartoony for me there. and we'll see what we can do ourselves in a little bit. Okay, now we're going to go down and we're going to choose merge. Now it's going to take a moment for this, because what's happening in the background, you can see up the top there, it's putting it together. Essentially what it's doing is it's building each one of the stacks of the HDRs and then merging them together in Panorama. And there we go, we can see it's done. Let me double click, there's our image, and we can see, well, look at that, we've even got a rainbow in there. We've got a great photo happening right now. So what we can do is go into the develop module, and if you want to give yourself a little bit more space, just collapse the left, and we just want to just make a few little adjustments here. I'm going to pull in the highlights just so I can start to see a little bit more of the detail in this area here where the sun is rising, and then we can just tweak the exposure just a little bit. So how often do you see a sunrise and a rainbow at the same time? So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the shadows just a tinge, and I'm just going to move the white balance just to warm it up just a little bit. There we go. And you can see we've been able to make those adjustments quite nicely and get a really good result. Now, I did mention I was going to tell you what would happen if it doesn't work, and let me show you a situation where it didn't. So here's a situation here where we've got this nice, it's kind of a panoramic view of the beach. So we can see, there's people at the beach there. Let me just back up a little bit. Here we go. And we can see we've got people at the beach. And I did exactly the same thing. You just select the first photo, select the last photo, right click, go into Photo Merge HDR Panorama. Now, let me show you the result from this photo. This is the result here. Now, there's something wrong. I don't know if you guys see it, but if you zoom in, notice we've got the doubling of these people. And that's because we've got ghosting, because we've got movement in this photograph. And also mismatched at that edge over here. Okay, so the one that we did just now, that drone shot that I shot just recently, I actually did that with a DJI Mavic, the Mavic 2 Pro. This one here was shot from a Sony a7 III. Now, was it because the Sony's no good? It's got nothing to do with the camera. Once again, it's because we've got movement in this shot, and you can see we've got issues with ghosting. Now, you can't fix the ghosting when you do the HDR Panorama. It doesn't give you that option. In fact, let me just quickly show you here. So we're going to select all these photos, and we right click and we choose Photo Merge HDR Panorama. And it's just going to take a quick second here for it to build the preview. All right, and we can see this is the preview. Let's turn off auto crop so we can look at the whole photograph. Now, overall, this is going to stitch together pretty well. And once again, in the previous lesson I just showed you guys with the HDR Panorama of Waikiki Beach, most of the time it's going to work like that and you're not going to have issues. So this is more of an advanced step here. If you are having those problems, and if we look in here, we can see we've got some problems with some different things here, particularly the doubling here, and this is called ghosting. And that ghosting is when you have movement between the HDR. Now, if I was just stitching together a panorama, you wouldn't have this issue. But because we're stitching it together as an HDR panorama, we see the movement and the ghosting. Notice there's no settings here to get rid of the ghosting when we're doing HDR panorama. So what do we do? Well, let me tell you what we do. The way to get around that is essentially you need to select each set of photos. So we've got those three, just like I showed you before, and then we're going to choose Photo Merge, and we're going to choose HDR. And notice we've got the ghosting there. Switch it to low deghosting because we have these settings are now available in the HDR. Then you're going to choose Merge. So what you need to do is go into each one of these sets, each of the three, and then you want to merge these together. Notice it's creating HDR. You can do more than one at a time. If I hold down the Shift key, select these three, right click, choose Photo Merge, and then choose HDR, I can do another set at the same time, even while the other one's working in the background. And we're just watching this, looking for ghosting when it pops up. Okay, so you can see that. Yeah, so essentially you're just going to go through each one of those shots, get rid of the ghosting 3 at a time, and then if we go to the end, eventually they're all going to be here. So this is what you'd want to do. You want to create the stack of the HDRs first. And as I showed you earlier on, when it creates this, it's going to create a DNG file. So do one of those for each of the brackets, and then take these DNG files. These are HDR files, but just treat them like the regular photos. Select all of them and then merge those to a panorama, and that'll work. Now, if you try to take them and make panoramas first, and then try to make an HDR out of the separate panoramas, it won't work. So what you want to do is take each set or each bracket, create a HDR photo, then take the HDRs, blend them together into a panorama, and then it will get around those limitations and allow you to do things like deghosting. So that's a little bit more of an advanced topic, which is, getting a little bit beyond the scope of this particular lesson. But I just wanted to leave you guys with the solution in case you come across that problem. I hope you enjoyed this class and you found it useful. Now, I've got a bunch of goodies I want to give you: Lightroom presets, actions, ebooks, and a whole bunch more at photoshopcafe.com/vault. Check it out. It's completely free. And join me for weekly tutorials on YouTube at Photoshop Cafe. So I'll see you guys next time.